So, a Supreme Court justice goes to the Grammys. Seems simple enough, right? But what started as a celebrity sighting, well, it quickly blew up into this huge debate about judicial conduct, intellect, and even these massive cultural divides. Today, we're going to deconstruct how a single moment of applause led to all this.
Okay, so this is where it all kicks off. This specific phrase, a Supreme Court justice applauding remarks against ICE. You gotta understand, this wasn't just some passing comment, it was the launching pad for a whole series of critiques, each one escalating from the last. So let's follow the chain.
Here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the applause itself, then dive into the calls for legal action that followed. From there, we'll look at the critiques of her professional conduct, and finally, see how it all got wrapped up into a much, much bigger cultural argument.
All right, so let's set the scene, at least according to the commentators we're looking at. Justice Jackson is at the Grammys. She was actually nominated for her audiobook. At some point during the show, she's seen clapping. Now, the absolutely crucial detail here is that the source characterized the remark she was clapping for as anti-ICE, and that specific interpretation, well, that's the spark that lit the whole fire.
Now, in the source's view, this wasn't just some, awkward public moment. No, it had immediate legal implications. That applause led directly to calls for her to recuse herself, basically to step away from certain cases that come before the Supreme Court.
And this became this central legal question. The commentators were essentially asking, hey, by clapping for a remark that we're calling anti-ICE, has she shown a bias? Does that make it impossible for her to be impartial on future immigration cases? And that brings us to this whole idea of judicial recusal.
So what is recusal, really? Think of it like a safeguard for the entire justice system. If there's any reason at all, to think a judge might be biased, or even if there's just the appearance of bias, recusal is the tool they use to make sure the process stays fair.
So how did the commentators actually build this case for recusal? Well, they zeroed in on a few key things. First, they didn't just say she clapped. They described it as enthusiastic involvement. They argued that this creates, at the very least, an appearance of bias on what is obviously a red-hot political issue. And the clincher for them? It was all caught on camera, making it totally indisputable in their eyes. But here's the twist. After laying out this whole argument for why she should recuse herself, the commentator then predicts that it's highly unlikely she would ever actually do it. So the point they were making wasn't just about the call for recusal, but the prediction that the call would just be ignored. And this is where the lens really starts to widen. The commentators use the whole Grammy thing as a springboard to jump into a much broader critique, shifting the focus away from that one single action to her overall conduct on the Supreme Court bench. This quote, "Sometimes listening can be better than speaking," was aimed squarely at Justice Jackson. It was used to set up this data-driven argument that, for a new justice, she just talks too much. They contrasted her style with someone like Justice Clarence Thomas, who, as you might know, is famously quiet during oral arguments.
Okay, so you see this number on your screen, 76,000. What on earth could that possibly have to do with any of this? Well, it was presented as the key piece of evidence to back up their critique of her courtroom style.
That's it, 76,000 words. This is the figure the commentators used to paint a picture of Justice Jackson as being, unusually talkative, especially for someone new to the court.
And to really hammer the point home, they presented this comparison. The claim was that she was twice as verbose as the next most talkative justices. And it's important to note, the source specifically identified them as, and I'm quoting here, her fellow liberal females. For them, this data was proof that she was breaking with the unwritten rule that new justices should listen more than they speak.
From here, the critique gets, well, a lot sharper. It moves from her courtroom style to her actual legal intellect. The commentator started pulling quotes from her own colleagues on the bench as evidence that her legal reasoning was, in their view, fundamentally flawed.
This quote, which they attributed to Justice Amy Coney Barrett, was presented as Exhibit A, and the commentators didn't just frame it as a simple legal disagreement. No, they called it a personal strike, basically suggesting that her arguments weren't just wrong, but completely at odds with the Constitution itself.
And they didn't stop there. Another example was pulled from a dissent they attributed to Justice Clarence Thomas. This description of her approach, empowering elite decision-makers under the guise of equity, was used to suggest her entire legal philosophy was a major concern for her colleagues.
So, the commentators kind of bundled all these criticisms together to make one final, pretty damning point. Their conclusion was that these weren't just your everyday legal back and forths. Nope. To them, they were clear evidence of a fundamental lack of intellectual prowess. Okay, and for the final act, the argument expands to its absolute widest point. The commentators connect everything, Justice Jackson at the Grammys, her conduct on the court, to this huge cultural critique involving Hollywood, celebrities, and politics. This quote was used to really capture what they see as a broad public frustration. The feeling that award shows aren't about entertainment anymore, they're about getting a political lecture. And in this context, Justice Jackson's applause wasn't just a personal act, it was a perfect example of this exact trend.
And to try and prove this claim of political bias in entertainment, the commentators pointed to this data on presidential Grammy wins. You can see what they're highlighting, right? Democrats like Obama and Clinton have multiple wins, while Republicans like Bush and Trump have 0. This was presented as clear evidence of a partisan slant in the whole industry.
And all of this leads to their one overarching theory, that Justice Jackson being at the Grammys wasn't just some random thing. It was a symbol of this interconnected liberal sect, where Hollywood, celebrity culture, and the government are all just one big, top-to-bottom ideological machine.
Which, in the end, leaves us with this question. The entire commentary, from a single clap to a critique of the whole judiciary, it really all boils down to this tension. For someone in a position like a Supreme Court justice, where exactly is the line between their personal expression and their professional impartiality? Where does private life end and public duty begin? It's a tough one to answer. What do you think?